Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work.
Hey there, podcast listeners. Jonathan here. Today's episode of the Social Work Podcast is about self-psychology. Now, self-psychology is part of the psychodynamic tradition, which includes drive theory, ego psychology, and object relations theory. And I know some of you hearing the word psychodynamic are thinking old stuff. But I got some good news for you. Self-psychology was developed in the 1960s by Heinz Kohut, who was living in Chicago. And in the world of therapy, the 1960s isn't really that long ago. It's about 15 to 20 years after Carl Rogers started developing person-centered therapy, which, by the way, is the most commonly used therapy to date. And it's about the same time that Tim Beck was developing cognitive therapy, which is probably the most empirically supported therapy out there. Now, self-psychology is neither widely used, nor does it have much empirical support. So why should you listen to the rest of this episode? Well, my guest, Dr. Tom Young, is really interesting. And he makes a good argument that self-psychology is the psychodynamic approach that has the best fit with social work. So if you dig psychodynamic therapies and you're a social worker, this episode's for you. If you're not, and you're a social worker, and you want to know why some people are psychodynamic, particularly self-psychology, check out this episode. It'll fill in all the details. So Tom is now a retired professor of social work from Widener University and the author of several publications on social work and self-psychology. He sees self-psychology as the only truly strength-based psychodynamic therapy. Now, that said, one of the critiques of self-psychology is that Kohut, like many theorists of his day, traced nearly every psychological problem back to the mother. In Kohut's case, he blamed mothers for a failure to empathize with their child. Now, this idea of empathy is central to self-psychology. Kohut was the first psychodynamic theorist to put empathy at the center of therapy, an act which some have suggested ushered in the era of relational dynamic therapy. And as Tom discusses, empathy in self-psychology is a way of addressing unmet developmental needs, which is slightly different than the way Carl Rogers saw empathy. Now, speaking of developmental needs, Tom and I talked about 3 experiences that Kohut said were fundamental in the development of the self: mirroring, idealizing, and twinship. Now, don't worry, Tom's going to bring those ideas to life. Now, one term that Tom uses that might need a little more explanation is self-object. And that's self-object without the hyphen, just one word, self-object. Kohut saw self-objects as things that serve psychological functions for the self that help us stay cohesive. They perform those functions through reflecting back who we are, providing us someone or something to idealize, or helping us feel connected to others. So self-objects are literally outside of a person, but are essential components of the internal self. Self-objects can be people, they can be objects, thank goodness, right? Because if they couldn't be objects, that'd be a totally bizarre choice of words. Or they could be activities. And here are a few examples. Have you ever had the experience of going out with friends that were new parents, only to realize that they've completely lost the ability to talk about anything other than their baby? Now, even though the baby is outside of them and hopefully at home with a babysitter, their baby is an essential part of the parent's new self-identity. Another example. If you take a mobile phone from a teenager and they say, "Oh, it's like you're ripping my arm from my body." Well, the phone is a self-object. The mobile phone connects teens to peers, and that connection to peers is one of the ways that developing teens feel whole. Here's another one. When you went away to college, did your parents give away your bedroom to a younger sibling or change it around so it looked nothing like your room? Did you feel upset? Like they were giving away part of you? Well, Kohut would say that your bedroom was a self-object. If you were surprised at how much you felt the loss of your room, Kohut would say, well, that makes sense, since we're usually only made aware of the role that the self-object plays when it's taken away. But once we're aware of its role, we can consciously turn to it during times of stress for reinforcement. And I think the easiest way to think about this is to think of a song or a piece of music that's gotten you through tough times. Now, I've had several friends for whom Stevie Nicks tunes have gotten through their worst times, literally times when they wanted to kill themselves. Music acted as a reinforcement, a way to put their fractured selves back together, even if just for a minute. And sometimes a few minutes of hope is all people need to stay. Tom talks about how self-psychology can be used with individuals, couples, families, and he mentions that it can be used with groups, but he also says that he doesn't use it with groups. And he also shares with us a case study of how self-psychology can be used with an adolescent male. Now, one of the things that he acknowledges is that self-psychology doesn't have a laundry list of techniques. It's mostly theoretical, and self-psychology has been criticized for not contributing new therapy techniques to a clinician's toolbox. And we end our episode with resources for folks who are interested in learning more about self-psychology. Now, before we get to the episode, I want to give a couple of shout-outs. First, thank you to everyone who responded to my request to fill out the PodTrack audience survey. At the end of the last episode, the one with David Covington talking about zero suicide, I asked folks to write a review on iTunes, fill out the PodTrack survey, and let me know if you want to donate a transcript. Well, thousands of people download the podcast all the time, but I know very little about you. But in less than 2 weeks after that episode, I had over 100 responses on the survey. And so thank you so much. If you haven't filled out the survey, you can go to socialworkpodcast.com. There's a link on the upper right. Now, so what did you tell me? Well, on this survey, you told me that you really like the guests. You like the introductions, the sort of the details that I give that provide context for the episodes. You like the topics. You really like the audio quality. And you said you liked the host, which, of course, gave me all the feels. Thank you. Now, 2/3 of you have listened to 6 or more episodes. And surprisingly, there were 4 people who responded to the survey who said they hadn't listened to any of the episodes, which is, well, actually, I don't even know what to make of that. Now, there were some things you didn't like. You didn't like it when episodes didn't have transcripts, and you didn't like the infrequency of episodes. Now, I hear you on both of those. Now, as for the transcripts, like I said, at the end of the last episode, I asked folks if they would be willing to donate their time to transcribe episodes, and I heard back from a bunch of you. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who contacted me with offers to transcribe episodes, and a big shout out to John West for donating his transcription of episode 104, Guardian of the Golden Gate, an interview with Kevin Briggs. And if you're interested in donating a transcript in exchange for a shout out in the next episode, please send me a message via the Social Work Podcast Facebook page. That's facebook.com/SW Podcast. Now, as for the frequency of the podcast, I promise I get them out as quickly as possible. I'm working on some ways to automate some of the tasks so that I can get them out more quickly. But until then, I humbly offer you my irregularly scheduled podcast. And now, without further ado, on to episode 107 of the Social Work Podcast, Self-Psychology and Social Work, an interview with Tom Young. Tom, thanks so much for being here today and talking with us about self-psychology. And my first question for you is, what is self-psychology?
Well, it's a theory, right? And theories are sort of mental metaphors that explain what makes people tick, how they behave, and why. And in this particular theory, which came out of psychoanalysis, it's a little bit inaccessible to a lot of normal people. Not that psychoanalysts aren't normal. So I try to keep it simple and also show how it's deceptively simple. So, for example, it's a theory that places the self at the very center of development. It's completely different from Freud's view. It's not about sex. It's not about aggression. It's about the self's desire for cohesion, for productivity, and for feeling vital, alive, and living a meaningful life. And the way the person had invented it, his name was Heinz Kohut, died in 1981. The way he mapped it out makes a certain amount of sense to me, even though I think the words that he used were somewhat cumbersome. He said every self needs to feel self-esteem. And in order to have self-esteem, in order to feel good about yourself, you have to experience being admired and enjoyed by other people, right? So he called that experience a mirroring experience, which is a little bit of a poor choice of words in my view, because it's not a simple reflection, right? It's like I risk showing you what I'm interested in, what kind of person I am, and then I wait to see how you respond to it, right? If you respond to it with interest, with enjoyment, with appreciation, then I feel like you sort of get me, right? And if I have repeated experiences of that kind, right, then it sort of consolidates within me a good feeling about myself, hence self-esteem, all right? The second thing he thought that we all needed in order to be sort of healthy, vital, productive selves was sort of an ability to regulate our own emotions and our behaviors, so that when we interact with other people and with things in the world, we have a certain amount of flexibility and, for lack of a better word, self-control in the process. And his view of how that comes about is quite similar to what I just described for self-esteem, is that when I'm little, anybody who's had a 2-year-old knows this, and they start to toddle and they sort of cruising around the house, and they are like unguided missiles. They can bang into just about any corner of an object that you have, and they're immediately hurt. Right? They didn't expect the corner of the table to reach out and knock them in the head. And so they turn, in their distress and in their pain, they turn to the parent to make it better, right? So the parent can only do what parents do. You pick the child up, you try to comfort them, you kiss the boo-boo, you try to distract them so that they don't sort of stay caught up in that kind of period of uncontrollable sobbing that is typically the case, and then typically what a parent will do after comforting a child will be to say, "Oh, come on, let's try to play this." So there's sort of a two-part process, or two phases to this experience that I'm trying to describe. One is sort of the comforting and soothing part, and then the other is the sort of inspiration, let's get back in the game part. Excuse me for being a little bit masculinist here, because it's mostly mothers that do this initially, of course. But again, repeated experiences. He called these idealizing experiences, Kohut did. So, that's the buzzword, just like mirroring. Idealizing, what does this mean? A lot of people just doesn't connect with anything. The way I make sense of it is that you have the young child needing to reach out to a stronger, more powerful adult who is sort of an ideal to the child, for lack of a better word. And through that interaction, the child gets comforted, soothed, and then also inspired to move ahead, move along, right? And again, if you have repeated experiences of this kind when you're growing up, what happens is that you begin to internalize this process of being able to sort of recognize your own discomfort and soothe yourself. I mean, even this phrase, self-soothing, sort of comes in a fairly direct way right out of self-psychology, as well as the capacity to reinvigorate yourself, inspire yourself, or find sources of reinvigoration and inspiration for yourself. So it's not something that happens in one interaction, right? It happens in multiple interactions over time. And the third piece of the puzzle that Kohut crafted is in some ways the hardest to understand. And he called it, he asserted that every self needs what he called twinship experiences. And it's much harder to explain, but I'll do my best here. A twinship experience is the experience of being with someone that you feel is like you and that you are like them, right? So this is an experience of belongingness, of connectedness, right? Of participating in some kind of community, no matter how small it is. And the best way to understand twinship is to not have it and see what happens when you feel like you're the only person like you in a room. So, for example, since we're both, social work educators, we know of students from minority groups who end up in a classroom where they're the only one from their group. And boy, do they feel disconnected, alienated sometimes, inept. They really feel, and I don't know, since I lived on the south side of Chicago for 10 years and used public transportation a lot, there were times when I was the only white person on a bus, right? And I knew then what it felt like to not have that twinship connection, right? I mean, you really feel like you're a fish out of water. Incidentally, I think a lot of kids with learning difficulties and attention deficit problems, this is an experience they have when they're very young. When they first go to school, nobody knows they have this problem. They know they're different, but nobody else knows they're different. And so it sets in motion a pretty difficult chain of development until somebody gets it, right?
Okay, so you have those three experiences in childhood and repeatedly.
Right.
You have these three repeated experiences. It's a developmental process, right? Not just once. And so what do you get from having those three experiences repeatedly?
Right. That's a good question. Well, what you get, or should get anyway, is a capacity to be able to monitor and your own self-esteem and regulate it, because in this universe, compost happens, and there are all sorts of slings and arrows that come our way, and we suffer disappointments, and our feelings get hurt, and we feel betrayed, or we feel ignored, or we feel injured, or disrespected, right? So these are all sort of situations that I think of as fairly common occurrences. And if you get these three things that we've been talking about, then you should have the capacity first to monitor and manage your own emotional reactions. Second, to monitor and manage your own behaviors in the wake of those emotional reactions, if we can think that way. And third, you should be able to identify other people who can help you when you can't do it yourself, because you've had repeated experiences where you know the kind of response that you need and the kind of person who's most likely to deliver it if you seek it out, right? So there's a way in which this process, the developmental process that we've been talking about, it never ends, that this is really something that we have to continue until our last breath, right? That we really need to be connected to the right kinds of others in order to function at our maximum productivity, efficiency, or whatsoever. In fact, I tell my students, we were talking earlier about evidence for this theory, support of this theory, and I tell my student, don't take my word for it. Do this experience with yourself. If you're in the presence of somebody who really gets you, who understands what you're going through, right? And who is comforting and inspiring in the way that I've been describing, in addition to their sort of understanding and appreciating you. And you feel in a way that you're with someone that is like you, right? So you're having in the present moment, not developmentally, in the present moment, today. If you're with someone who delivers those three things to you, do you function better than you would if you didn't have this person? To a person, they all say right away, yeah, we understand what you're getting at. We understand what you're getting at. And I think that's what Kohut was getting at, too. That this theory really is a theory for life. And so that raises the next question.
And the next question is, so if you don't get these three things, if you don't get the twinship experience, the mirroring, and the
idealizing,
and the idealizing,
right,
then what happens? How does the person experience life?
Well, this is where I think the theory becomes most useful for social workers, right? Because remember, Kohut put the self in the sort of center of this psychological universe, which is really a psychosocial universe, right? Because it's all relational, it's all interactive. The self needs to feel good about itself. The self needs to feel that it's an agent under its own control. The self needs to feel connected as a member of some sort of community, right? So if you don't get it in the ways that we've just been talking about, then you find ways to make up for it in a kind of a substitute way, right? So all of a sudden, things like substance abuse, violence and aggression, sexual addictions, to me, using this theory, become problematic substitutes for getting the kind of self-esteem, the kind of feeling of control and regulation, and the feeling of belonging and connectedness. I say they're problematic because we know what drugs, sex, and violence do. Rock and roll, of course, is exempted. That's really, I think, what's most helpful for social workers, because the rest of the world tends to view drug, sex, and violence in a very sort of moralistic way. I mean, right? It's dangerous and it's destructive, and that's all true, right? But if you're going to help somebody, get out from under these sort of, I think of them all as sort of addictions of a certain kind, you have to understand what the function of the dysfunction is, right? Right,
and you can't say, well, you're addicted to drugs because you are a morally deficient person.
Right. Someone has probably already told them that, right? And for somebody who is, let's just say, dependent on pick cocaine, because it's one of those substances that makes you feel big, and makes you feel good, and makes you feel smart, makes you feel happy. It's all the things that you would hope would happen without needing the cocaine, right? But if somebody's going to kick cocaine, then we have to provide them with an alternative experience that doesn't involve the white powder.
So would you say that cocaine provides an idealizing experience?
I think that's a great question. I think that recreational drugs can provide multiple self-object experiences. I hadn't used that word self-object before, so I've got to backtrack a little bit right now, right? The cocaine becomes the self's object because the self is using the cocaine to generate this enhanced feeling of strength. This is the idealizing part. Happiness, maybe a certain feeling of sort of togetherness or cohesion. I'm on my game. I'm high, but I'm on my game, kind of thing. And then I don't know whether it also has an impact on self-esteem. I haven't had that much experience personally with cocaine, but I think that there is this sort of illusion of just good feeling that comes from it. So that's what I mean when I think a particular substance can actually generate more than one self-object experience. Sort of thinking out loud here about violence and rage. I think rage is not so much a twinship experience. Rage is, and aggressive rage is really a substitute for feeling very vulnerable and very powerless. And there's nothing quite like rage to reverse that feeling.
So let's say you have a client who comes in who's got addictions, who is aggressive. Maybe this is a kid in a juvenile justice setting.
Sure.
And you start to understand his situation using these concepts. These are things that are reflective of not getting certain things developmentally. How does that turn into treatment? How does that turn into what you do? What do you do with that now?
Right. That's a great question, because I think this is the hardest part of the theory for most people. Because first of all, our culture wants the violence to stop, and wants them to stop using drugs, right? So immediately we're sort of predisposed to want to change this kid, right, and his behavior. Secondly, we might actually be, maybe frightened a little bit or disgusted in some sort of moral way with his behavior, depending on what form the violence has taken. So what this theory asks us to do is to put all that desire to change him on the shelf or on a back burner, and first understand what is it like for him, right? I mean, how does he actually feel when he hits somebody? What does it do for him? It's almost like a kind of a slow motion replay process that I think is fundamental. I think it's at the heart of empathy, right? It's like we look at this behavior from the outside, and we think we know what it means, but that's not what's really important here. What's important is to understand it from the inside. What is it like for him? What are the kinds of situations and the feelings and the thought processes that he's having leading up to, scoring some drugs and using them, right? What kinds of situations, what kind of provocations precede a violent episode on his part? How is he actually feeling when somebody calls him a racial slur or any sort of derogatory name? Because just to sort of carry on with this a little bit, I think what frequently happens is that there is this almost a feeling of panic that the self is going to be obliterated or taken over or controlled or demolished in some ways.
So you understand the violence as protective in a sense. Like this is, I'm going to attack first before I'm attacked. I'm going to defend myself before somebody destroys me.
Yep. That's another way in which the self-psychology completely turns Freudian psychology on its head. Aggression is not primary in self-psychology as it is in Freudian psychology. Aggression is a byproduct. It's almost like a breakdown product, right? If the self is not feeling safe, if it's not feeling cohesive, appreciated, then violence is a admittedly poor substitute, but it works, right? So people people hear about self-psychology, and usually when people like me, hold forth on it, we make a big deal about empathy. And most people start to yawn after 2 or 3 minutes, right? Because they think, oh, empathy, we know about empathy. Well, we don't know about empathy. None of us really knows what it's like for another person until we try to understand that other person, and that other person helps us understand them, right? So, for example, I tell my students, about your assessments and your treatment plans, until your client really feels that you get them, you don't really have anything you can count on, right? Because only when a person feels that, like if I feel that you get me and that you appreciate me, some of the things we were talking about before, I will tell you things about me that I wouldn't tell you until I felt that you got me, right? So for this hypothetical kid that you're talking about in the juvenile justice system with a record of violent behavior and substance abuse, right? It won't be until he really feels, in some sort of emotionally safe way that we get him. It won't be until then that he'll tell us how it is that he becomes violent and how it is that he resorts to using drugs and when and where. And then we can formulate a treatment plan, right? We can start to talk to him in words that aren't unique to self psychology. We can start talking about triggers, right? We can talk to him about starting to monitor his own emotional reactions to things, even get him to predict when he'll cross the line, when he goes into the red zone, right? And then we can start to talk with him about, say, okay, so we know what going into the red zone happens. We know what happens to you when you go into the red zone. You get busted. You end up talking to people like me, right? What would work for you other than violence as you're approaching the red zone? And what's interesting about this is how people create their own treatment plans. I mean, they think of things that are much more effective and much more creative, typically, than we do. We say, we'll get a punching bag. Well, the kid's not going to carry a punching bag around the neighborhood, right?
That's right. Or come up with your anger thermometer.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's the hard thing for clinicians, clinical social workers, clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, psychiatric nurses. I mean, the hard thing for them, for all of us really, is to get behind that behavior and to really go that extra step in understanding what's going on inside the person. And then, if we succeed with that, then we're actually working with the person and finding ways for them to achieve good feelings about themselves, the capacity to regulate their emotions and their behaviors, and the ability to interact with other people in a way that works for them, meaning works for them so that it keeps them out of that red zone.
So it sounds like empathy is a central concept, and it's empathy almost as a tool to allow your client to trust you, that you get them. I know in social work we often talk about empathy in terms of Carl Rogers. Mm-hmm. Genuineness, empathy, unconditional positive regard. Mm-hmm. Is there a way in which self-psychology understands or conceptualizes empathy differently?
Well, I don't think it would be radically different. What's radical is probably the emphasis placed on it, the centrality of it in terms of interventions that are derived from the theory. I don't want to talk trash about the Rogerian thing. It's about more than just repeating back to the person what they've said. It's generating with words your understanding of a person in his or her context, which is both contemporary, where they live now, but also historically, right? So for example, when I meet with clients and I ask them, going back to this hypothetical situation with the kid we were talking about before, if we get to talking about approaching the red zone, right? One question I want to ask is, now, I think this has happened to you lots of times in your life, right? When was the first time you remember coming up to this red zone like this, right? So your empathy does deepen, right? It's really becomes the more you understand what a person is actually going through, the more you're entering, in this case, the more you're entering his universe and leaving yours, out in the waiting room someplace. If that's which is also a hard thing for people to do, for clinicians to do, I think. It's hard to sustain what Kohut referred to as an empathic immersion in someone else's psychological life. Psychological understood both in contemporary context and historical. It's not easy to do. We all have our own brains. You can't unhook them. You can't disengage them while you're doing this. And so it's kind of key to be able to sort of keep yourself focused on this person's experience and understanding this person's experience. So then, get back to your question, you're right. Empathy is not only an assessment tool, but when the person starts to feel it, right, it actually sort of has therapeutic effects. Even though we're not even talking therapy yet, we're not talking intervention yet, we're talking understanding, but the more a person feels understood, as we were saying before, the better they function, even in the moment.
So that raises the question, assessment and then intervention. Are there things that are specific to self-psychology in terms of intervention?
I don't think there's anything specific. I think that's one of the reasons why, to my knowledge, self-psychology has not generated a manualized treatment that can be, evaluated in sort of standard research fashion. But I do think that if you're using this theory, as your understanding of the person deepens in this empathic way that we were talking about before, you'll begin to see, both historically in the person's life and in the way the person interacts with you, what that person's self is seeking for most now. Whether they're I don't know how long it's been since you worked with adolescent kids, but I remember working with adolescent kids in a psychiatric inpatient unit, and you could tell which kids were starved for mirroring experiences, right? They will tell you how wonderful they are for hours on end, right? And it's really because they have been treated like, little snots.
Like they're not wonderful.
Like they're not wonderful, that's right. And other kids will sort of present themselves as being pretty much totally unregulated, they have, like we say, they have, impulse control problems, right? Well, that's a person that needs a strong figure to stay with them when they're feeling unregulated, right? And figure out ways to deliver some of that comforting and calming, tone of voice, just the way you position yourself physically with a kid, you don't get in his face, you sit down alongside him, he's, you know what I mean? And, you try to initiate conversations, you're looking a little out of sorts, what's going on? You get a kind of conversation going where you actually accept the role of the idealized other, or you accept the role of the self-esteem bringing mirror, right? Or you accept the role of just being with, particularly for those kids who feel so different from the rest of the universe.
So the treatment process is actually being those three types of self-objects.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's more a therapy of being than it is of doing. That's right.
Yeah, and I can see how that would be tough to manualize, because you wouldn't say, sessions 3 through 7, you are the mirroring object.
Right.
Because it wouldn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't.
And, we've been talking about kids, but this treatment can work for anybody, because you said this is a process that goes on throughout your life.
That's right. That's right.
Is this something that you can use with couples and families, not just individuals?
Got it. Yes, I think so. In my own work, I do see many couples. And if you stop and think about the kinds of experiences that we were talking about earlier, in a marriage, or it doesn't even have to be a marriage, but a committed, long-term relationship, doesn't have to be heterosexual, it can be homosexual. What are some of the things we're looking for from our partner? Aren't we looking for some of that sort of acceptance, that builds self-esteem? Aren't we looking for comfort, when we're disappointed, and down? Aren't we looking for somebody that we feel we can sort of navigate this world with together? Someone, that we belongs with us kind of thing, right? So I think what happens with a lot of couples in distress is that something has happened in their life together that has made them fearful that they're not going to get this from the other person, right? And as soon as they get fearful that they're not going to get this from the other person, then the other person becomes like the enemy, right? And so the very foundations of intimacy get eroded by this fear that the other person is going to hurt us rather than provide those kinds of experiences. So when I work with couples, I spend a lot of time trying to say, what's your worst fear here? And isn't that fear that you're not going to get some of these good things, right? And with families, too, I think funny thing about families about how some children can remind their parents of the person that they were afraid they might become, or the child will remind the parent of a sibling who's gone astray, kind of thing, right? And so what happens is that the parents in a family situation, they start interacting with the child out of fear that the child's going to become something they don't want the child to become, and then that fear also erodes the process, or compromises, or corrodes the process of the kid getting, the sort of self-esteem enhancing, the self-control, building, and the interpersonal kinds of skills. So I think the theory can underpin a lot of systemic work, and for those of your listeners who are interested, I did try to articulate that in an article that was published in the Social Service Review back in the early 90s called Environmental Modification in a Self-Psychological Perspective. And I think a lot of social workers end up in positions where they could help systems recalibrate so that the people in those systems would get more of this sort of self-enhancing experiences with each other, rather than this sort of fear-based, distancing kind of interactions with each other. But yeah, I think I find it a pretty versatile theory in terms of working with children, with adolescents, with adults individually, or in couples, or as parts of family systems. Other people have applied it to work with groups. I have not done that. But it's sort of interesting to think about, right, how in a group experience, as envisioned by Yalom, we were talking about Yalom earlier, underneath that group process, who would be getting these kinds of experiences, and what could a group facilitator do to make it possible for the group members to provide them to each other? So I think there's an application there too, although it's not something that I'm particularly knowledgeable about.
Are there resources that you can recommend for folks who want to know more? And we can put links to those on the Social Work Podcast website.
Okay. Well, this can get a little autobiographical here. I only met Heinz Kohut once, but I knew his wife for about 3 years. Actually, one particularly stressful time in my life, I was seeing her for counseling therapy. Betty Kohut is her name. And she had a very close friend who's also a social worker. Betty Kohut was a social worker, and her close friend Miriam Elson was a social worker. And Miriam Elson actually worked professionally with Kohut, Heinz Kohut, as well as being friends socially. And she's written a book, Self-Psychology and Clinical Social Work. And I mean, could be maybe even 15 years old now, but it's still available, and it's in paperback, and I think it's published by Norton. And then that book you and I were talking about earlier that Helene Jackson edited, the exact title of which escapes me at the moment, but people like that because it chapters are each chapter applies the theory to work with a different population. So, you can get more target problem focused in that book than you can in the one by Miriam Elson. There is a series that a lot of people don't know about that I think is very valuable. It's called Progress in Self-Psychology. And I think that's put out by the Analytic Press. It was edited by a man named Arnold Goldberg for years. He doesn't do it anymore. But Goldberg was a collaborator and contemporary of Kohut's. And every year there were annual conferences in self-psychology. People came and gave papers applying the theory to different situations. And those papers then got compiled in this series called Progress in Self-Psychology. And I think it's one of the richest sources for people who really want to know, how do I use this stuff?
That's great. Well, we'll put links to those on the Social Work podcast. And of course, any of the stuff that you've published, we'll put links to those on there as well.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah. So what are some of the limitations of self-psychology?
Well, I think a big limitation in our current era is that everybody wants a fix for any one of the disorders in the DSM, right? I mean, if you have anxiety, you have depression, you have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, or panic with or without agoraphobia, on and on and on. It makes perfect sense that that everyone would want to know, look, isn't there a treatment for this? Isn't there an intervention that fixes this?
Right, like dialectical behavior therapy for women with borderline personality disorder who
right.
self-harm.
Exactly. Exactly. And in all fairness to self-psychology, it was not developed with that goal in mind, right? So a potential limitation is that if you're looking to sort of cure schizophrenia or reconstruct a borderline personality disorder or eliminate panic attacks with self-psychology, that's a waste of time, right? Because self-psychology really is an empowering psychology, and so the person is always bigger than, more than the symptom or the disorder. And what self-psychology is trying to do is to empower the self that's contending with the disorder or the diagnosis. So even a person struggling with schizophrenia can be related to, interacted with, in a way that is guided by self-psychology. And if it's done in the way that we've been talking, then the person struggling with schizophrenia feels empowered in the way that we were talking about before to deal with his or her schizophrenia. And similarly for the other disorders that we were mentioning. Lots of times I think, I don't understand exactly why this is, maybe just because it came out of psychoanalysis, but people sometimes criticize self-psychology for being a deficit model. And I guess because, the absence of mirroring developmentally or the absence of idealizing or something, that it leads in a sort of psychoanalytic worldview with structural deficits in the personality. Yeah, you can go there, but I don't think Kohut was coming from that place at all. He was coming from what is every self striving for. Every self seeks to be healthy. Every self wants these kinds of experiences because it makes you a more vibrant, a more cohesive, a more productive, a more creative person. That's the way all selves want to be. So I see the theory not as a deficit model, but more as a strength-based model. It really, with the focus on empowering the self, no matter what the self is contending with in terms of these other kinds of disorders.
And that really fits with social work.
I think so.
Yeah, because social work, the way that it's being taught these days, the way it's been taught for 15, 20 years is focus on strengths, the strengths perspective, right. Focusing on what your client brings to the table, resilience, and all those sorts of things. And
exactly.
It sounds like self-psychology, from your understanding and how we've talked about it, really fits well with that.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm so glad you mentioned resilience because I think the resilience research converges on this theoretical formulation of self-psychology. If you get these kinds of experiences that we've been talking about, you are a more resilient person, no matter what your circumstances are.
So that could be one of the reasons why somebody who grows up who is at risk,
right,
could be resilient because
right.
They had these experiences of somebody mirroring, their goodness, and who was able to, over years, provide them with that.
Exactly, and we call them protective factors. Right?
That's right, the protective factors.
The protective factors in the risk and resilience framework. Right.
Well, Tom, this has been great. Thank you so much for taking time out and talking with us about self-psychology. I really, really appreciate the insight into the model, and I hope that folks out there listening get as excited about it as I am.
That's great, Jonathan. Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Hey, it's me again. See? Nothing old stuff about that episode. All right, so quick reminder, fill out the audience survey. If you like what you hear, please leave a review on iTunes, and let me know if you want to transcribe an episode. Okay, here comes the klezmer music.
I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.